to pin down, because here, don't mean as much as the tears on both of them. You're not just arriving in Israel, or in Palestine, or Gaza, or you're arriving in all of it, and in none of it, because depending on who's speaking, this or a stolen home, a divine inheritance or a colonial tragedy. And tonight, as you sink deeper into this 240-minute lullaby of sand, history, and slow-burning heartbreak, you're going to feel the weight of every side, every sigh, every splintered dream and barbed wire fence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up with your boots already covered in dust. Not sand, dust. The kind that clings not just to your shoes, but to your eyelashes, your lungs, and eventually your memory. Because this isn't the kind of place you just pass through. This is the kind of place that keeps you long after you've left. You're standing somewhere between Tel Aviv and Ramallah. Somewhere between a luxury high-rise and a military checkpoint. Between a country that calls itself the startup nation, and a people still waiting to start a nation. You feel the heat first. Dry, crackling heat that makes the horizon shimmer and bend, as if even the air itself is unsure where the lines fall. In the distance, there's a man harvesting olives. His family's been doing it for generations, under the watchful eye of empire after empire. British, Israeli, all with the gun, the stamp, the deed. Argue whether this land was ever truly empty, as some early Zionist settlers believed. You stand among centuries-old terracing, ancient irrigation channels, and stones carved by hands long forgotten. Hands that, depending on your textbook, were Arab, Jewish, Canaanite, Roman. There's a mainstream fact here that no one disputes. People have lived on this land for a very long time. The oldest known town in the world, Jericho, lies just east of you, dating back over 11,000 years. Civilizations have risen and fallen like tides here. Hebrews, Philistines, Crusaders, Caliphs, Mamluks, and the British Empire's brief, bureaucratic cameo. But the quirky part? There's a little village south of Hebron where locals still swear that Cain, the biblical son who murdered his brother, is buried beneath a large stone. They built a shrine around it, despite the fact that historians agree the story is, well, metaphorical at best. Is layered. Metaphor bleeds into history, walks hand in hand with memory, and sometimes it's hard to tell whether you're visiting a country or a wound. The road you follow twists like a scar. To your left, you pass a Jewish settlement. Red-tiled security fences. It looks like any American suburb if you ignore the watchtower. Not in Hebrew, not in Arabic, but in English. He wants to know where you're from. You tell him. He nods. Then he asks the only question that ever matters here. And who do you think it belongs to? Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we belong to it. You follow the boy's soccer ball until it disappears behind a crumbling wall. And that's when you see it. An old railway track, rusted and broken. It connected Jaffa to Jerusalem, bringing oranges, olives, and letters home. Now, it connects nothing to nowhere, just another path interrupted by history. You keep walking. Up ahead, the road splits. Left leads to a settlement, new houses, fresh paint, Hebrew street signs. Right leads to a refugee camp. It's a spectrum. In peace. Others came with maps and rifles. Some wanted to live beside their Arab neighbors. Others believed coexistence was just a phase before conquest. Historians still argue whether Zionism was always a colonial project, or whether it was corrupted by the fears that followed the Holocaust. But this much is certain: it began as a dream to end Jewish homelessness. You walk alongside a mural, a painted image of Theodor Herzl, the so-called father of political Zionism, standing on a balcony in Basel, Switzerland, declaring that in 50 years, there will be a Jewish state. He said it in 1897. In 1948, it happened. You pause at the edge of a village built by early Zionist pioneers. It's called a kibbutz, a collective farm where labor and land were shared. Picture socialists with rifles and a strict vegetable-growing schedule. Not exactly a utopia, but close if you squint past the guard tower. But you can't stay in nostalgia long, because something's shifting. You start noticing the fences, the boundaries, the invisible lines people carry in their eyes. You pass an Arab shepherd with a transistor radio tucked in his coat, playing Egyptian love songs. He nods at you, but there's weariness there. He's heard the story before, too many times. Because here's the quiet twist in the Zionist tale. When early Jewish... Far from it, there were villages, markets, mosques and churches, families with land deeds passed down for centuries, people who didn't always call themselves Palestinians, but who absolutely knew they lived in Palestine. And suddenly, the Zionist return because it an ascent. It says everything about how sacred this return was meant to be. You sit on a cracked stone wall, where in Arabic are scrawled in graffiti. One says, "We belong." The other says, "We were here." Both are true. You hear a taxi honking. On its dashboard is a tiny Israeli flag and a plastic hamsa, a palm-shaped amulet used by both Jews and Muslims to ward off evil. It sways as the driver weaves past potholes and checkpoints. Somewhere in the distance, a wedding erupts. Music, ululations, laughter. It could that marks the site of the first statue of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, captured mid-declaration. The state of Israel has arisen. Historians still argue whether Israel's creation was an act of liberation or an act of ethnic engineering. Some say it was survival. Others say it was replacement. What no one disputes, that it changed everything. And that brings us to the shadow that looms over every conversation here: the Holocaust. Because it didn't just kill 6 million Jews. It killed the illusion that the world would ever protect them. You enter a small museum, quiet, cool, lit by on the wall, photos of survivors stepping off ships in Haifa, kissing the ground, emaciated but smiling. Behind their eyes, everything you feel the dust again. It sticks to your hands like grief, and you keep walking. You walk past a well. It's not deep, just old. Stones rounded by time. Into its rim, half worn, half proud, tells you the year it was dug. 1911. Ottoman rule. A time before the word Israel meant more than scripture, and Palestine was a region on British, but not yet a nation in the modern sense. You crouch beside the well and imagine what it looked like then. Olive trees, goats, a woman drawing water as her son chased chickens through the dust. Maybe the man who dug the well hoped his grandson would inherit not just the land, but the quiet certainty that came with it. But history doesn't do quiet well. You stand, brushing dirt from your knees, and the view widens. You're in Palestine, or what used to be called that, before partition, before walls and airstrikes, before anyone thought to ask whether you needed permission before the lines. Historians still argue whether Palestine was full before the 20th century. Some say it was a product of modern. Insist it's been here. But here's the thing, when you ask people who grew up in these hills what they are, they don't the town. I'm from Nablus. I'm from Beersheba. My family's from Jaffa. It's personal before it's political. And as you wander through the alleys of old Jaffa, the salt air still clinging to the plaster walls, you realize why. Before the statehood declarations, the UN votes, and the front page wars, this place was home. Not in theory, in tomatoes, in cousins, in the way bread was torn and passed. You reach in. Now the window's dark and dusty. Sticky and warm. The smell of rose water leaking into the street. That's a homeland, too. Not just land deeds and slogans. You turn the corner and pass a building pocked with bullet holes. Above, time layers strangely here. The past is a neighbor, not a memory. A grandmother leans from her window. Rumors started. First it was whispers about land purchases, road closures. British soldiers, tired of refereeing a fight they didn't understand, preparing to. Because here's what people forget. Before the 1948 war, there were many Palestines. Not just Muslim, but Christian, Armenian, Druze, Circassian. It was a patchwork of identity, complex and contradictory, like every old port city before borders hardened and stored. Jewish communities too. Long before Zion lived in Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Safed. As minorities, sometimes in peace, sometimes not. They were part of the mosaic, not yet the frame. But something changed in the early 20th century. You pass a tiny glass. One map is from 1915, another from 1937, a third from 1946. The same land, redrawn like a restless child rearranging furniture in the night. Roads become fences. New towns bloom overnight. The borders pulse like bruises. And then you see the Peel Commission map. 1937. the first real proposal to split the land into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Jewish portion? A narrow coastal strip and a slice of Galilee. The rest? Many of the groves were complicated. When things over in Jerusalem, it showed French comedies and everyone laughed at the same jokes. And when the power went out, because it often did, they lit. Now, even the memory feels like fiction. You pass another plaque, this one in English, site of the British Administrative Centre, 1948. This was the era of the Mandate, a time when London decided they issued contradictory promises. It's too large to be useful, ornate, rusted, a house key. Fled in 1948, never allowed to return. He doesn't wear it for utility. You wonder, what stone? You keep walking, and the land keeps watching. You keep walking, but the signs start to switch languages. The Arabic fades. The Hebrew grows bolder. You've entered a different time zone. One measured not in hours but in historical promises, in partition plans, in paperwork long since yellowed with disappointment. The British Mandate period was supposed to bring structure to this land. Spoiler, it brought paperwork and powder kegs. From 1920 to 1948, Britain played reluctant landlord, promising the same living room to two tenants who increasingly hated each other, and then wondering why the walls were full of holes. You pause outside what used to be a British police station. The door is chained shut, but the symbol was the era of passports issued in triplicate, of Arab protests and Jewish underground militias, of white papers and quotas, of long. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, a one-paragraph letter that supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It said that nothing should prejudice the rights of existing non-Jewish communities in the region. The problem? Those communities made up over 90% of the population. A national home for one, the house of another. Was naive idealism or calculated colonial strategy. Either way, it set the match close to the fuel. By the 1930s, tensions ignited. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 was a full-blown uprising against both Britain and Israel. You stroll past olive trees where British soldiers once set up ambushes, near villages bulldozed in retaliation. Isn't just physical, it's linguistic. Even now, some Palestinians call collaborators with the state Balfour Boys. Meanwhile, Jewish paramilitary groups like the Irgun and the Stern Gang weren't exactly mailing assassins. One 1946 attack on the King David Hotel killed over 90 people. The building still stands. So does the tension. You spot a British-era railway line, unused except by vines and memory. A quirky fact, during World War II, Some Jewish resistance fighters were trained in sabotage techniques by the British to fight Nazis, only to later use those skills against the British themselves. You wonder if anyone really thought this would end well. You pause at a dusty archive in a sleepy town once used as a mandate administrative post. Inside, old letters. One from a Palestinian mayor in 1937 pleading for limits on land sales. Another from a Jewish council urging the British to protect new settlements. The handwriting is beautiful. Full of invisible conversations. But beneath it lies the wreckage of miscommunication so vast that even Google Maps struggles to make sense. Fair. Either way, civil war, not a metaphor. Literally the next day, you walk through a town that voted for the plan, another that rioted against it. Both have been renamed. Both have plaques written in the language of the victor. There's a radio on in a cafe nearby. It's playing Kulthum, an Egyptian singer whose voice was once heard across every Arab capital. Her songs used to signal the start of the news. During the British Mandate, people would turn her off at curfew and turn her back on after checking whether their neighbors still had a roof. You sit down and sip bitter coffee, the kind that kicks at your teeth and leaves grounds at the bottom, like the future of this place. Muddy and unpredictable. The man across from you smiles. The British were good at two things, he says. Trains and leaving messes behind. You nod, because here the train may have stopped. Every day, you stand again, walking past a mural of a man you don't recognize. Below it, scrawled in Arabic. We told them it was our land. They said they had a letter, and that, in a way, was the whole mandate in a nutshell. One people with documents, with nowhere else to go. You don't see the line until you're already standing on it. Point. Not even a roadblock. Just a small concrete marker set in the dirt, unnoticed by most. But this is the line where one story ends and another begins. Where one family celebrates independence and another. This May 14th are gone. The ink is dry. New State of Israel, read aloud by David Ben-Gurion in a Tel Aviv art gallery. No anthems, no parades, just the birth of a country between falling bombs. Meanwhile, across hills and valleys, another word is spoken in a dozen dialects, always the same weight in the mouth. Nakba, the catastrophe. You walk through a village that no longer exists except it does in memory. Deir Yassin, Lifta, Al-Tantura, towns emptied, burned, abandoned in panic, others in violence. Even more so was planned expulsion or tragic side effect. Whether it was war or cleansing, defense or erasure, the only truth you find is in the faces of those who left and those who stayed. You visit a house in Haifa. It looks like any other, white stucco, bougainvillea spilling over a stone fence. But the current owners found something odd in the closet. Rusted. Original family, Palestinians who fled to Lebanon in 1948 and never returned. They still send letters. No one answers. You drive a little further and enter a tented museum in a refugee camp. The guide is a teenager with perfect English. He with an old woman in Nablus. Her voice quivers when she speaks of her wedding day. We left with only what we could carry. My husband brought our wedding photo. I brought rice. She still has both. The photo is in perfect condition. She touches it like it still breathes. You walk beside a ditch where railroad ties used to lie. A boy selling figs says it leads to nowhere. He laughs. Like the UN, he adds. That's another ghost in this part of the story, the international community. In 1948, they watched away, but few intervened when 750,000 their records vanished or rewritten. A quirky fact: in the weeks after independence, Israel's new ministry deal with the Arab refugee problem. That memo was never intended for public reading. You reach a kibbutz built atop the ruins of a village called Al-Manshia. One man shows you a grain silo that used to be their mosque. He doesn't say it proudly or with shame, just factually, as if truth has nowhere else to go but forward. But some truths don't move on. Some live in suitcases, in keys worn around necks, in a grandmother's refusal to say Israel, even as she pays the electric bill to its government. She still says inside, as if her real home is just waiting behind some door history hasn't opened yet. You visit a synagogue in the south. A rabbi speaks of survival. His parents escaped Poland with forged papers and a suitcase of candlesticks. You ask, is Israel or disputed territory, or simply home? You're heading into the years where borders didn't just change. They pulsed, contracted, exploded, then reformed with the precision of military maps. It's the summer of 1949. The guns have barely dried on the armistice line. Controls 78% of the land. Gaza is in Egyptian hands. The West Bank, Jerusalem, sliced awkwardly in two, like a holy cake no one could agree how to cut. Wire fence dividing East and West Jerusalem. On one side, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. On the other, the Western Wall. And somewhere beyond, the Dome of the Rock. Faiths pressed against each other like strangers on a two-full bus. Wars. Many of them. You climb a hill where an Israeli outpost once stood in the Sinai. Below, the desert stretches like a waiting battlefield. It's 1956, and Israel joins Britain and France in invading Egypt after Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. The war is short, messy, and two fading empires dragging their young into a gamble that ends with a You walk further. The sun is hotter here. It's 1967 now, and you're holding your breath, because this is the war everyone... Israel, surrounded by Arab nations threatening war, launches preemptive strikes and the map entirely. The Golan Heights, Gaza. Military victories of the century. But every victory plants seeds. You look out over the West Bank, terraces of land, minarets in the distance, and here they come, the settlements. Not the towns of 1948, but the outposts of a new era. Concrete, fences, bypass roads, ideology built into architecture. A quirky detail. Some of the earliest Israeli established by secular kibbutzniks. But as time passed, the most determined settlers were often religious nationalists, believing they weren't just living on land, but fulfilling prophecy. You pass a settler outpost surrounded by coils of razor wire and solar panels. The children ride bicycles. A goat chews through a plastic fence. He lives here. He shrugs. Aria in the Bible, he says. Why wouldn't I live here? What else can you do? Meanwhile, on the other farmer can't reach his own olive trees without a military permit. He says nothing, just looks at the horizon like it's closing. You follow an old pipeline road that once fed water into Gaza. It's 1973 now, the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria strike back on Israel's holiest day. The surprise is devastating. For a moment, it seems Israel may fall. But it does. It always does. And the world, once again, holds its breath. Some call it survival. Others call it expansion dressed as defense. Historians still argue whether Israel should have withdrawn immediately after 1967. Whether holding on to land for security made peace more elusive or simply more conditional. But what's not in dispute? The cost. You walk the edge of the Golan Heights. Wind turbines spin slowly above old minefields. Signs warn of unexploded ordnances. You wonder how many children have grown up learning which fields are safe to kick a ball in, and which might bite. The Palestinian one, a UN banner, and a white one painted by the kids that says, it's not a declaration, it's a plea. And the maps, oh, the maps. You step into a small office where a former diplomat keeps rolled up charts of every border since 1947. He unfurls them like a magician revealing secrets, each one more fragmented than the last. The 1967 lines, the Oslo Accord zones, the security barrier, settlement blocks, restricted roads, bypass routes, military zones, each map less legible, each line louder. And yet, despite all this, the conflict's borders are never just geographic. They run through kitchens, through textbooks, through lullabies and GPS apps that won't let you drive down certain streets. You pause at a falafel stand on two sets of prices. The outskirts of a refugee. Shatila, Janine, names that echo in headlines, sometimes in blood, but mostly in silence. People here don't live in houses, they live in waiting. Waiting to return. Waiting for recognition. Waiting for the world to remember. You pause outside a concrete wall, every inch covered in murals. Old women holding up ID cards issued before their country vanished. One boy has drawn a map of Palestine, not but the one from his grandfather's wedding invitation. Inside the camp, the streets are barely wide enough for a donkey cart. You sidestep laundry lines, uneven pavement, and kids playing with rusted bike parts. A girl with a plastic bracelet waves at you. "My home is Jaffa," she says. She's never been. She was born here. Her mother left Jaffa with only a pot and a Lod and Acre, official British documents from the 1940s. They laminate them next to wedding photos, not as proof for international courts, but as memory insurance. Taller than your shoulders. Inside, 3 generations, 1 teapot, and a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. They offer you bread, ziyadar, and stories. One man shows you the key he keeps around his neck. Another offers a photograph, his father's orchard. "He planted the trees in 36, he says. They're still there, just someone else eats the fruit." Historians still argue whether the right of return is symbolic or practical. Israel fears it means demographic collapse. Palestinians say it's not about numbers. It's about dignity, recognition, closure. You leave the house and head to a nearby rooftop. From here, the camp stretches endlessly, and flags. But beyond it, on the far edge of the valley, is a settlement. Neat, fenced, guarded. It has a pool. The juxtaposition is almost cruel. You remember a 5.9 million. Some are middle-class professionals. Some are stateless. Passport is just paper. Some were born in Gaza and have never left, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. And yet, within all this, there is still life. A wedding passes you in the alley. Drums, laughter. No one knows where the bride's family is originally from. But tonight, it doesn't matter. When he sees her, you sit beside a man who's drawn the outline of a house on his wall. "This is where the courtyard will be," he says. "I'll build it when we go home." His grandson plays beside the chalk lines, treating them. You ask. He just looks out the window toward the hills and keeps imagining them without fences. You walk again, this time through an NGO-run school. Israel. She teaches geography alongside poetry. The groves, about seagulls on the Mediterranean. Many have never seen the sea. You step into a library with no bookshelves, just stacks. A volunteer explains, "They get borrowed faster than we can shelve them." One of the most popular titles? A history of cities that no longer exist, not because they were destroyed, but because they were renamed. You find a battered copy of an atlas. Inside, a child has drawn a smiley face over Ramla. Scribbled next to it, "My Sido was born here." Sido, Arabic for grandfather. The page smells faintly of glue and lemon soap. And there it is again, this soft defiance. This not through hatred, but through geography, through names. You sit beneath a satellite dish, listening to the call to prayer. A man next to you is fixing a water tank. You ask him if he ever gets and says, gently, "I'm not waiting, I'm remembering." You walk back. Children who ask if you've been to Haifa, to Acre, to the sea. You say yes. They nod, wide-eyed, as if you've visited Narnia. One of them slips a folded paper into your hand. It's crude, sweet, and bold. A house with flowers, a keyhole big. You keep it, because even if you don't know where the story ends yet, you know one thing for certain. No one here has forgotten where it began. You walk out of the camp, the alleys behind you slowly swallowed by the fading light, but the weight of it lingers, like the drawing still folded in your pocket, like the word home echoing in unfamiliar accents. You step back onto the main road, and the scene shifts again. This time, it's the West Bank. An Israeli settlement. Tidy, clean, perched on a hill like it's posing for a real estate brochure. There's a sign in Hebrew. New homes available. Safe, secure, scenic. Well-lit, exclusive. Off-limits to Palestine. A Palestinian village. Stone houses huddled together, electric lines sagging. Finished school. The road here is cracked, potholed, sometimes blocked by army checkpoints that can appear and vanish like rain. Occupation is not a phrase everyone agrees on. The Israeli government calls it disputed territory. Palestinians and much of the international community call it occupation. You just call it confusing, because here, legality is relative, justice comes in quotas, and security depends entirely on who's holding the permit. You pass a steel gate with a surveillance tower looming above it. A soldier watches you from behind mirrored sunglasses. He doesn't wave. You don't stop. That's the dance here. Calculated distance. A mainstream fact. Since 1967, over 130 official Israeli settlements and around 100 unofficial outposts have been built in the West Bank. Today, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers live beyond the 1967 borders. Most of them were born here. Many believe this land was never truly Palestinian to begin with. Judea and Samaria, they say. This is our birthright. But here's the quirky twist. Some of the land these settlements sit on was never officially expropriated. It was labeled state land based on Ottoman law, which said land left revert to state ownership. That law, created by an empire long gone, now determines where someone can or can't build a home. You walk a little farther and come across an olive grove, or what's left of one. Dozens of trees have been uprooted, tagged, or fenced off. You meet a man named Fawzi, who's lived here his whole life. He tells you his trees were older than him, until settlers cut them down one night. They say it's for security, he shrugs. But you tell me, how dangerous is an olive tree? He hands you a piece of flatbread soaked in fresh oil. You eat in silence because what can you say? You climb a small ridge for a better view. Below, the landscape resembles a jigsaw puzzle someone gave up on. Settlements ringed with fences. Palestinian villages choked by roadblocks. Patches of farmland sliced apart by the separation barrier. A 440-mile-long wall of concrete, fences, trenches, and motion sensors. The Israeli government says the wall prevents terror attacks. Palestinians say it steals land. Historians still argue whether the wall is a symptom or a cause, defensive necessity or tool of annexation. But no one argues about its impact. The wall land. One village has the wall literally curling around three sides like a concrete arm. You visit a woman named Amal whose house is now sandwiched between the wall and gets no sun. Her visitors need permits. She calls it living in parentheses. You believe her. Down the road, you see something surreal. A checkpoint decorated with rainbow flags and a banner that says, Pride for Peace. It's an Israeli settler protest, demanding more recognition for LGBTQ soldiers. Just beyond it, a Palestinian protest chants for the right to harvest olives. Realize that out here, they stack. You walk through Hebron, a city divided not metaphorically, but literally. Streets where Palestinians can't drive and in some places can't walk. Settlers live above shops that are permanently shuttered below. Feels haunted. The silence isn't peaceful. It's watched. A quirky fact. Palestinian families have metal cages around their balconies. to stop settlers from throwing stones or trash at them. It's not law, it's improvisation. You meet a settler family who invite you in for tea. Their home is spotless. The father is kind, the kids are shy, the view is stunning. You ask if they worry about the friction. He says, that doesn't come without tension. You thank him. Then you visit a Palestinian shopkeeper whose storefront was welded shut by order of the military. Vegetables from a cart. He laughs when you ask if he's hopeful. Hope, he says. Hope is for people who still have choices. You walk with different license plate colors. Somewhere between olive trees and observation towers, between a permit and a prayer, between the world as it is and the world as it could be, the hills begin to slope downward, and as you descend, so does the tone of the land. You're approaching Jerusalem now, city of postcards and pilgrimages. The living, groaning, overcrowded Jerusalem. Checkpoints, rival flags, and silent resentment layered like stone. The first thing that hits you isn't the view, it's the tension. You enter the old city through Damascus Gate. Tourists with cameras, locals with shopping bags, soldiers with fingers resting casually on triggers. Have carried pilgrims, poets, prophets, and protesters. The air smells like spices and diesel, frankincense, frying dough, dust. Jerusalem isn't one city, it's 100 cities in the same place, all pretending not to notice the others. You pass Jewish men in black coats, their curls bouncing with and embroidered abayas. Armenian priests shuffle by, a Greek tour guide. Above it all, minarets and church bells and Hebrew prayers, sometimes layered, sometimes clashing. This is the heart of it, the eye of the storm, the most sacred square kilometer on earth, and the most contested. A mainstream fact, within just a few acres, the old city of Jerusalem houses the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the holiest site, the third holiest in Islam, and they are, quite literally, stacked on top of each other. Historians still argue whether Jerusalem has ever truly been shared. There were periods of uneasy coexistence, golden ages, some call them, but for every brief harmony, there have been sieges, riots, and broken windows. And now, even the way you walk through the city tells someone else where you stand. You follow the path to the Western Wall. Security is tight, faces are solemn, notes stuffed into cracks. The prayers are whispered, rocked, swayed like lullabies for something long buried. You step back, and just overhead, the golden dome of the rock gleams in the sunlight. One faith's holy foundation, another's former temple mount, both visible, both claimed, and that's the Jerusalem contradiction in a nutshell. So close, so far, so sacred, so sad. You walk into East Jerusalem, past homes painted in fading beige and blue. Some belong to Palestinians whose families have lived here since the Ottoman era. Others belong to new Jewish settlers who've moved into these homes through court rulings, or, in some cases, quiet overnight takeovers. One woman invites you in. Her living room has a view of the Mount of Olives. "We've lived here since 1924, she says. "The deeds are in Ottoman Turkish. My son had to learn the language just to fight the court case." She's not bitter, just tired. You pass a Jewish settler family whose apartment was once part of her grandfather's home. They wave at you, offer tea. They say they're fulfilling a calling. That no place is more Jewish than Jerusalem. That their grandparents dreamed of returning too. And there it is again, that unbearable symmetry. Two dreams. One hill. You keep walking. Down to Silwan, a Palestinian neighborhood often caught in the spotlight of excavation and eviction. Israeli archaeologists are digging tunnels here, hoping to uncover the city of David. The ruins are real. So is the politics. Because when you dig in Jerusalem, you're never just unearthing stones. You're making a claim. A quirky fact. Some Silwan families say the vibrations from underground digs crack their walls. They've started posting before and after photos online. Archaeology as slow-motion eviction. You follow the crowd to the Al-Aqsa compound. You can't go in today. Non-Muslims are restricted at certain times. Outside, a boy sells dates and postcards. He tells you this is the one place his grandmother still feels free. They can't take this, he says. Not yet. A few hundred feet away, a Jewish family is escorted by armed guards to visit the Temple Mount. They're praying silently, quickly. Cameras flash. The tension rises. You don't stay long. You climb up to a rooftop cafe to catch your breath. From here, the old city glows in gold and gray. The skyline is a forest of minarets, domes, antennas. Across the valley, you see Israeli neighborhoods in West Jerusalem, cafes, bookstores, kids on scooters. On this side, Palestinian homes with black water tanks on every roof. The tanks aren't decorative, they're compensation for irregular water access. You sip strong coffee and watch the birds. They don't know where the lines are, they just fly. Someone once told you that peace in Jerusalem isn't hard because of theology. It's hard because everyone here has keys. Keys to houses, to shrines, to histories. And no one agrees who locked the door in the first place. Historians still argue whether the international community could have stepped in to internationalize Jerusalem after 1948. Whether it would have prevented this deepening tug of war. But like most ideas involving this city, the plan never outlived the paper it was printed on. You step back into the street as the muezzin calls for prayer, and a Hasidic boy passes you carrying a prayer book. They do not look at each other, not out of hate, but out of habit. And that's the hardest part. Not the violence, not the politics, but the way silence becomes muscle memory. You reach a staircase that leads to a street called Al-Wad, the spine. Cuts through the old city like a vertebrae of history. Each step feels like you're walking across time. You stop halfway down. A man is singing softly in Hebrew. His voice rises like smoke. Across from him, an old woman sells candles and incense. She hums along. Different tune. Same rhythm. And for just a second, the sounds don't argue. They echo. They share the air. Then the wind shifts and the harmony is gone. But you heard it. You leave the old city behind, but it clings to your shoes like its dust always does. Quiet, persistent, a kind of memory you can't brush off. The road south curves gently. You pass checkpoints that blink red and green like uncertain traffic lights, and then the skyline flattens. This is Gaza, or rather the edge of it, because getting in or out is not simple. You don't fly into Gaza. You don't drive straight through. You are filtered, examined, approved, or not. You reach the Erez crossing, Israel's primary checkpoint for entering Gaza. It feels more like an airport terminal mated with a prison. There are corridors, scanners, reinforced doors. The silence inside is industrial, cold, and buzzing. On the Gaza side, it's different. The air smells like engine oil and brine. A stray cat stares at you like it knows you don't belong. You begin to walk. Gaza is only about 25 miles long and 7 miles wide. It has roughly 2 million residents. That makes it one of the most densely populated places on Earth. And yet, somehow you can still feel empty space here. Not because there's room, but because there's so much missing. A mainstream fact. Since 2007, Gaza has been under an Israeli-Egyptian blockade. Officially, it's for security, an attempt to isolate Hamas, the political and militant group that controls the Strip. But to ordinary Gazans, it often feels like collective punishment. Goods, fishing limits, medical shortages, shelves. A generator hums outside, louder than you expect. The pharmacist smiles. The electricity will go out in 20 minutes, she says. So we memorize. Further along, a man signals better from the Israeli. Irony, right? You walk along a beach. The sea is bright, blue, too beautiful to belong to a place so troubled. Children splash past fishing lines they know will catch little. The coast here is rich in sardines, but both Gaza is occupied. Israel withdrew its settlers and soldiers in 2005, but it controls the airspace, maritime access, imports, exports, and who gets in or out. Some call it a prison. Others say it's a hostile entity under siege. The truth sits somewhere, bruised between the terms. You visit a university library. The power flickers. The librarian gives you a flashlight. We use it for finals week, she says. Students crouch over books, scribbling notes in the dimness. You ask what they're studying. One says international law. Another says English literature. A third says electrical engineering. You smile. That's practical. She shakes her head. Not here. You walk. Smiling boys turned into posters from every wall. Some fought, some didn't. But here, there's little distinction. A quirky fact, Gazans fly kites, not just for fun, but as protest. They've flown burning kites across the border fence during marches, setting Israeli fields alight. It's a kind of warfare so low-tech it feels like myth, but it's real, and it burns. You stop at a bakery where a line stretches around the block. Bread is subsidized. People joke that Gaza runs on sugar and adrenaline. Inside, the baker tells you his oven runs on wood now. Gas is too scarce. The dough waits longer than the people. He laughs. Children crowd around you, asking questions. Where are you from? Have you seen snow? Is it true that there are shops in America with 100 kinds of cereal? You know. They whistle like you admitted to living in Narnia. You pass a pile of rubble that used to be an apartment block. A boy points to a corner where a curtain still flutters from walls. The border fence looms in the distance. It's high, reinforced, patrolled, watched by towers and drones. It runs along much of Gaza's boundary, slicing through farms and memories. Israel says it's necessary. They point to rocket attacks of infiltration. And they're not wrong. Gaza's been the launch pad for thousands of projectiles. Life under that constant threat isn't peace. It's roulette. But then again, you've now seen what happens behind the fence too, where people live with 3 hours of electricity and drink water too salty to wash with, and bury their dead in cemeteries so full they've had to stack graves. Historians still argue whether Hamas is a liberation movement or a terrorist group. Most governments have chosen the latter label. Inside Gaza, the political and the personal blur easily in places where elections are rare and fear is routine. At night, you sit on a rooftop under the hum of a generator. Someone passes you tea sweet, strong, served in a glass cup. The stars above Gaza twinkle. Of drones. They never stop. Some nights they just circle. Other nights they fire. Tonight they're quiet. You wonder how long that'll last. A boy sets a lantern on the roof. It's Ramadan, he says. We light one for everyone who didn't make it. There are a lot of lanterns. You take a breath. The salt air cuts through the smoke. And somewhere beyond the fence, another life plays out, as if on a parallel channel. But here in Gaza, time feels suspended. Movement is measured not in miles, but in power cuts. Losses, dreams deferred. You close your eyes, listening to the drone above. And you wonder, What kind of sky doesn't blink? The hum of the drone fades, not because it's gone, but because you've grown used to it. That's one of the side effects of long conflict. Your ears recalibrate. What once jolted you awake becomes background noise. Fear becomes routine. And injustice? It becomes paperwork. You leave Gaza in silence. Through corridors, X-rays, and long stairs. The questions at the checkpoint are brief, but they're not really questions. They're reminders of who controls what, of who decides who crosses and who stays behind. Back in the West Bank, the landscape is greener but no less tense. You find yourself on a bypass road, new asphalt, lined with security fences, connecting Israeli settlements to one another without passing through Palestinian towns. It's efficient, seamless. It avoids friction by pretending nothing else exists. But you turn off that road, and suddenly you're not in Israel anymore. You're in Area A. That's what the Oslo Accords called it, a strange euphemism for Palestinian-controlled zones. Except they're not really controlled. Israeli troops can still enter at will. Palestinian police can't leave without permission. It's a form of autonomy that tastes like dependency. You stop in a cafe in Ramallah. A boy plays with an iPad. A man watches soccer. Someone orders a freedom smoothie, strawberries, and sarcasm. The Wi-Fi is strong. The occupation is stronger. A mainstream fact, since the 1990s, the West Bank has been divided into 3 administrative zones, Areas A, B, and C. Area A is under nominal Palestinian control. Area B is shared. Area C, about 60% of the land, is under full Israeli control. Most settlements are in Area C. Most demolitions happen there, too. You visit a school near Nablus that straddles the line between Areas B and C. Half the building has permits. The other half doesn't. The principal jokes that even the chalkboard is illegal. A settler road cuts across their soccer field. We just play around it. One student shrugs. Historians still argue whether Oslo was a breakthrough or a trap. Whether it was a noble step toward peace or the bureaucratic cage that locked Palestinians into a permanent waiting room. Either way, the peace process has become less about peace and more about process. You walk to a village named Khan el-Ahmar. It's tiny, a scattering of homes made from tires, metal sheets, clay. The Israeli government has tried to demolish it for years, claiming it was built illegally. The villagers, Bedouins, say they've lived here since before there were permits. A quirky fact, the local school is built out of mud and rubber. Children paint flowers on its walls. There's no playground, just a slope and imagination. You watch as settlers pass by on the highway nearby, their windows up, their GPS set to routes that bypass every place like this. You step into another Palestinian town, Hebron again, this time deeper. You walk down Shahada Street, where Palestinians are no longer allowed to drive, and in many places no longer allowed to walk. Israeli settlers live above, Palestinians below. The balconies are caged. The shops are welded shut. You meet a shopkeeper who opens a side door for you. Inside, his store is full of dust and disuse. "I sell souvenirs," he says, holding up a t-shirt that reads, "Welcome to Hebron." You ask when he last sold one. He laughs. To a German journalist. In 2009. He keeps the store open anyway, out of spite or pride, or maybe just because closing it would feel like surrender. You walk past a security post where a soldier is watching a teenage boy sweep the sidewalk. The boy sweeps like he's daring the dust to come back. You want to say something, but you've learned by now, here, people carry words like grenades. You don't throw them unless you mean it. You step into a home with 2 families living in it. One family owns it. The other, settlers, were moved in by court order. The 2 families live with a curtain strung across the kitchen. They share a roof. They don't speak. You ask one of the owners how they manage. He smiles. "We make noise when they sleep." You don't know if he's joking. You continue walking and stumble into an Israeli checkpoint where a line of Palestinians waits to enter East Jerusalem for work. It's 5:30 a.m. The sun hasn't risen. The air is thick with exhaustion and silence. Men press ID cards against bulletproof glass. House, my wife, my language. They're not. He doesn't finish the thought. He just goes inside. You step back and look at the architecture. The metal bars, the gates, the concrete. It looks like a zoo exhibit designed by someone who studied dystopian fiction a little too seriously. And then you remember something you read. Occupation is not always about tanks. Sometimes it's just about who gets to drive. You watch a settler zoom past in a shiny SUV. Then a Palestinian farmer trudges by with a donkey cart. They don't acknowledge each other, but you see them both. You see the divide, not just in concrete, in air, in permissions, in who gets to move and who has to ask. You veer off the main road and follow the sound of something unfamiliar in this landscape. Laughter. Not just a chuckle, but that full-bodied kind of laughter that makes your chest tighten because it feels almost out of place. You find it behind a low wall, in a schoolyard where a group of teenagers are playing soccer. The ball's worn, the goals are made from stacks of rocks, but the joy is real. For a moment, you could be anywhere, Buenos Aires, Jakarta, Chicago. Until one of them limps, you notice his prosthetic leg, and the moment snaps back to where you are. You're in Jenin, or maybe Beit Lahia, or one of dozens of towns where growing up means learning to recognize tear gas before you know algebra. You sit by the edge of the field and watch them play. You ask a student, thin, maybe 17, what he wants to be. He shrugs. Alive, he says. After that, a graphic designer. You laugh with him, but not entirely. Because here's a mainstream fact. Over 50% of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are under the age of 18. That means most of the people living through this conflict weren't alive when it started. But they carry it anyway, in their routines, their stories, their bones. You pass a mural painted by kids. It shows two doves tangled in barbed wire. Below, in block letters, we just want recess, not revenge. You stop at a youth center. A girl named Yara is organizing a poetry reading. She's 16. She reads you her latest poem, in English. It begins, "My first memory was a wall. My second was a gun. My third was my brother saying, 'Run.'" You thank her. She nods. She's read it to journalists before. Historians still argue whether youth radicalization is inevitable in occupied zones. Whether teaching hope is realistic when futures are sealed in concrete. But you begin to suspect that the only thing more dangerous than angry youth is youth with nothing left to feel. You travel next to an Israeli school near the Gaza border. The windows are reinforced. The walls are painted with cartoon tigers and musical notes, but the corners double as bomb shelters. A teacher shows you the evacuation drill schedule. "We do it more than math," she jokes. You can tell she's tired of joking. One student, maybe 9, asks you if you've ever heard a color red siren. You shake your head. He mimics the sound for you perfectly, then explains how many seconds he has to find shelter. He's proud of his timing, like it's a sport. You sit beside a playground. The swing set creaks. The shadow of a military balloon floats overhead, barely visible in the blue. You realize you're seeing two generations growing up in lockstep fear, each taught that the other is a threat before they've ever spoken. Each shielded from humanity by the soft arm of nationalism and the hard edge of necessity. A quirky fact, in some border communities, Israeli and Palestinian students used to join online video exchanges, talking over Zoom, playing music together, drawing peace murals. The programs were small, hopeful, and often shut down when politics caught up. But for a moment, they drew maps of each other's faces. You step into a Palestinian home near Bethlehem. A teenager named Rami invites you into his room. On one wall, a poster of Tupac. On another, a collage of demolished homes. On the desk, homework about the Crusades. He tells you he wants to leave. "Not forever," he says. "Just long enough to breathe differently." Later, you meet an Israeli soldier at a checkpoint who looks no older than Rami. He's scrolling his phone. He offers you a bottle of water. "This isn't who I want to be," he says without looking up. But the army's not optional. You ask what he wants to do instead. He shrugs. "DJ. Maybe study in Berlin." You can't shake the parallel. Two boys, two passports, two cages, different shapes, same lock. You walk a dusty road between villages. There's graffiti everywhere, some of it political, some of it just teenage. Free Palestine is scrawled beside a crude cartoon of a cat riding a tank. Underneath, in English, Ahmed was here. You smile despite yourself. Somewhere in this mess, someone still wants to leave a mark without blood. You stop for tea at a family's house. The oldest son tells you about his arrest. He was 16, picked up for throwing stones. No trial. 3 months in administrative detention. My mom said I came back quieter, he says. She doesn't know if that's good or bad. You ask what changed. He looks at his younger brother, then says, I learned how not to cry. The tea cools. The night settles in. You're invited to a youth center in a Jerusalem suburb where both Jewish and Arab teens gather twice a week. It's guarded, monitored, fragile, but it exists. You listen to a music session where an Arab rapper and a Jewish violinist improvise a song together. They don't sing the same language, but the rhythm syncs. The audience claps, but cautiously, because peace here isn't loud. It whispers, and so do the young. You leave that night thinking not of borders, but of bedrooms, of playlists and school books and text messages sent across checkpoints, of teenagers who've never met but hate each other anyway, because someone taught them how. And you wonder, what if no one had? You wake up the next morning to the sound of chairs being arranged. Plastic ones, scraping against concrete. A peace summit of sorts is about to begin. Not in Geneva, not in New York, but in a municipal hall that smells faintly of dust and weak coffee. This is where peace talks come to sweat. You're attending a meeting of local elders, community leaders, and a few foreign diplomats with lanyards and weary smiles. The kind of summit no one televises. The kind that tries to stitch rips while the fabric is still being torn. You take a seat in the back. A Palestinian farmer from the Jordan Valley speaks first. His voice is low but firm. He talks about checkpoints that make harvesting dates impossible, about permits that vanish without explanation. I don't want a flag, he says. I just want to pick my fruit. Then a rabbi from a nearby settlement speaks. He talks about rockets from Gaza, about kids sleeping in safe rooms, about dreams interrupted by sirens. Peace is not a fantasy, he says, but sometimes it feels like one. You watch as translators try to keep up, as metaphors get lost in the gaps, as sighs are universal. This is what peace talks look like down here. Not formal treaties, but tired people trying not to shout. A mainstream fact. Since the 1990s, there have been more than a dozen formal peace proposals: Oslo, Camp David, the Roadmap, Annapolis. They promised land swaps, mutual recognition, demilitarized states, shared capitals. Some got close. None succeeded. Historians still argue whether peace failed because of bad faith or bad timing, whether spoilers on both sides sabotaged fragile progress, or whether the very structure of negotiation was flawed from the start. What's certain, the phrase peace process has become more brand than plan. You flip through a folder left on a table. Contains a map, 2 states, 1 capital, a line down the middle like a shared custody agreement. On the back, someone's written, "How do you draw borders around memory?" You step outside. The hall is small, but the stakes are not. Because for every inch of land negotiated, there's a house, a grave, a fig tree, and each one tells a different version of the same truth. You walk through the remains of a village where one such peace plan once suggested resettling refugees. The buildings are skeletal now. Children ride bikes through what was supposed to be phase 2 of a post-accord reconstruction. The funding dried up when negotiations collapsed. The bike stayed. You meet a man who worked security at one of the early summits. He still carries the badge. "The hotel buffet was amazing," he says. "The agreement? Not so much. That's the irony, isn't it? That for all the ink spilled in luxury hotels, peace remains stuck in roadblocks and resumes. It's a job title no one's managed to fulfill." A quirky fact: in the 1990s, there was an actual Israeli-Palestinian comedy tour called Laughing for Peace. 2 guys, one Arab, one Jewish, who traveled and told jokes about the conflict. They were funny too. One of them still performs. The other moved to Canada. You ask why. He says, "It's easier to tell jokes when the bullets aren't real." You stop by the ruins of a failed peace center. The walls are still up, the paint faded. The slogan out front reads, "Together is possible. A bird has nested in the O." You head north past a military base that used to house joint patrols, Israeli and Palestinian forces side by side. It lasted about 6 months. The partnership dissolved after an argument over uniforms. Symbols matter even when the goals are shared. In a small office in Ramallah, a peace activist shows you binders of every major negotiation. "We keep copies," she says, "because if you don't remember the promises, it's easy to pretend they were never made." You sit with her, flipping pages. Every paragraph feels like déjà vu confidence-building measures. Land swaps, timetables, confidence collapses, land disappears, timetables expire. She offers you tea. "This work breaks your heart," she says. "But so does doing nothing." You ask what keeps her going. She points to a photograph of her and her friend, an Israeli woman, standing at a protest together. "She's not my enemy," she says. "She's my headache." That's different. You leave as the afternoon calls to prayer and bells ring out from a distant church. The sound overlaps, discordant, but not unpleasant, like they're trying to find harmony but keep choosing different keys. And now you walk through the garden of a man named Gideon. He's a former negotiator, long since retired. He's planting tulips. "Peace," he tells you, "is a lot like gardening. You can't force it to bloom, but if you don't water it, it definitely dies." He laughs, then adds, "And sometimes the deer eat it anyway." You help him carry a sack of soil. He thanks you, then says, "You know what ruined us? Maps. We kept negotiating maps. We should have negotiated stories." You nod because you've seen enough to know he's right. You walk to the edge of his land, and in the distance, a settlement gleams on the hill. Below it, a Palestinian town swells in the heat. They share the same aquifer, the same air. They just can't seem to share a future. But somewhere, between the binders, the murals, the protest signs, and the tulip bulbs, a question lingers. Not can there be peace, but rather, can we want the same future if we don't remember the same past? You head west now, past checkpoints and citrus groves, into territory that feels less like a battlefield and more like a boardroom. Welcome to the arena of influence. Because if the land here has been shaped by boots and bulldozers, it's also been carved by aid packages, foreign policy briefings, UN vetoes, and quiet phone calls made in Washington, Moscow, Brussels, and Beijing. You're about to walk through the part of the story that isn't written in stone, but in strategy memos. The first thing you notice is the flags. American, fluttering over a newly built training center. European, tucked modestly into the side of an aid office. Chinese, bright and loud on a construction site. There's a reason the Middle East has always been more than just itself. It's a mirror, and every great power wants to fix its hair in the reflection. Let's start with the United States. A mainstream fact, the US gives Israel around $3.8 billion in military aid per year. It's the largest recipient of American foreign aid. That number has remained steady across Republican and Democratic administrations. You pass an Israeli military base partly funded by that aid. The soldiers there train with American-made weapons, their tanks upgraded with US technology. The slogan on the wall reads, "Am Yisrael Chai," the nation of Israel lives. Across the hill, in a Palestinian town, you see American involvement of another kind, a USAID logo on a new school. It's bright, modern, solar-powered. The students inside learn English from a textbook that features Michelle Obama on page 1. But here's the rub. The school is funded by the same country that vetoes most UN resolutions critical of Israeli policy. So while America gives pencils with one hand, it often stamps rejected with the other. You ask a teacher what she thinks of US involvement. She laughs softly. "They love us quietly. They love Israel loudly." Historians still argue whether US bias is strategic, ideological, or electoral. Some say it's about shared democratic values. Others point to lobbying power. A few point to guilt left over from World War II and the Holocaust. Whatever the reason, America has played defense attorney, investor, and sometimes reluctantly mediator. You walk into a conference hall in Jerusalem where a peace envoy is giving a press conference. The slogans are familiar: new era, bold steps, bridges, not walls. You count the number of times the word security is used. It's 12. The word equality is used once, and that was in a question from a journalist. You exit through a side door. It's quieter there, but not for long, because now you're in Europe's orbit. You visit an EU-funded wastewater treatment plant in the West Bank. It's efficient, sleek, necessary. It also gets shelled once every few years accidentally by one side or the other. The engineer shrugs. We just keep rebuilding, he says. European nations, unlike the US, often talk about international law, human rights, two states. They issue statements. They send diplomats. They fund NGOs. But they rarely apply real pressure. Sanctions are discussed, then shelved. Trade deals continue. A quirky fact: France once suggested placing international monitors in Jerusalem. It was ignored. Germany once proposed an economic peace fund. Passed but never fully launched. You sit with an activist who works for an EU-affiliated monitoring group. Her job is to document home demolitions. She tells you she's witnessed over 30 in the past 2 years. We file reports, she says, but they mostly go into drawers. Then you hear her say something you can't unhear. Sometimes it feels like Europe sends bandages while handing over the knife. You walk farther west, metaphorically now, into the halls of the UN. The UN has passed hundreds of resolutions affirming Palestinian rights, condemning occupation, calling for peace. Most are symbolic. Some are enforceable. The enforceable ones? They're often blocked by, you guessed it, the US veto in the Security Council. In a refugee camp near Nablus, you visit a UNRWA school. Kids sing songs about return, about peace, about places they've never been. The teacher shows you a globe. Palestine is there, but only if you squint. Back outside, the UN flag waves, but the budget shrinks. Some member states have slashed funding. Others redirect aid to private projects. Meanwhile, the needs grow. You sit on a bench beside a mural of the UN logo being slowly erased by wind. And then there's Russia and China. Russia plays chess in this region, supporting Syria, talking to Hamas, selling arms to various players, but always from a distance. You meet a man in Gaza who jokes, Russia doesn't take sides. They sell to both. China, meanwhile, builds roads, stadiums, cell towers, infrastructure, diplomacy. They rarely speak about the conflict directly, but they vote at the UN. They host delegations. They watch. Historians still argue whether new global players will shake up the stalemate or just layer new interests on top of old ones. One theory: as US influence wanes, the vacuum will be filled. But with what? You pass through a museum in Ramallah that features a room called Foreign Hands. Inside, documents signed in Paris, Cairo, Washington, Oslo. They hang from the ceiling like mobiles, dangling, spinning, slowly collecting dust. And this is the core contradiction of foreign influence in the conflict. Everyone wants peace, but few want to pay the price for it. So they fund, they film, they frown in press conferences, but they rarely force the issue. You walk to a hilltop with a view of Tel Aviv's skyscrapers. Behind you, the hills of Qalqilia encircled by the wall. Two worlds, 30 minutes apart. Politically, galaxies away. A plane flies overhead, headed for Europe, maybe, or Dubai, or back to Washington. It doesn't stop here. It just passes over, just like the world often does. You follow the shadows of that plane as they vanish into the hills, and soon find yourself walking along a quiet stretch of land that looks, at first glance, peaceful. No sirens, no checkpoints, just olive trees and wildflowers. But then, in the distance, you hear it. A thud. Not the kind that shakes buildings, but the kind that shakes memories. You're walking into the heart of two uprisings, intifadas as they're called, which in Arabic means shaking off. But what exactly is being shaken off? Occupation? Fear? Restraint? History? maybe all of it. The First Intifada began in 1987. It wasn't planned. Sparked like a match. A car crash involving an Israeli military vehicle and a group of Palestinian workers in Gaza. Rumors flew. Protests erupted. Stones flew. So did bullets. And something ancient stirred in the streets. You enter a town that still carries the marks of that era. Graffiti half-faded on crumbling walls. Stencils of martyrs with slogans written in both sorrow and pride. Old tires stacked behind fences. Not for decoration. A mainstream fact. During the First Intifada, tens of thousands of Palestinians, many of them teenagers, took to the streets. They boycotted, they marched, they resisted with rocks and strikes and songs. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed. Hundreds of Israelis, too. It wasn't just about violence. It was a generation trying to be seen. You meet a man in his 50s now, but a teenager then. We didn't know what we were doing, he admits. We just knew we were tired of asking permission to breathe. A quirky detail. During the First Intifada, Palestinian communities created underground schools when Israel closed theirs. Volunteers taught math and history in basements, garages, orchards. Sometimes with guards posted outside. The curriculum wasn't just letters and numbers, it was dignity. You follow the road to a city square where the Oslo Accords were once celebrated. Hope bloomed like a shy flower. Leaders shook hands. Doves were released. TV anchors used the word breakthrough. But it didn't hold. And by 2000, it all cracked again. The Second Intifada was darker, bloodier, fueled by broken promises, political failure, and the image of a right-wing Israeli politician, Ariel Sharon, walking on the Temple Mount with 1,000 police officers. The match lit again. But this time, it didn't burn in protest. It exploded in cafes, buses, pizza shops. Suicide bombings became the language of the desperate and the damned. Retaliations followed. Invasions, demolitions, curfews that lasted weeks. You enter a town that lived through it all. The rubble's mostly cleared now, but the scars remain. A family points to where their house used to be. A photo album survived under the floorboards. It's warped, smells like smoke. Inside, smiling faces frozen just before everything fell apart. You walk through a memorial garden, not for soldiers but for civilians. Names in Hebrew and Arabic. Children, bus drivers, students. No politics on the plaques, just birth years. Some as recent as 1998. Historians still argue whether the Second Intifada buried the peace process or just revealed it was already dead. Whether it was a strategic choice by Palestinian leadership or a spontaneous eruption of a population pushed too far. The reality is it changed everything. The wall went up. The checkpoints multiplied. The belief that the other side just wants to kill us cemented in hearts and headlines. You pass a mural painted over and over with the same image. A boy with a slingshot facing a tank. Iconic, poetic, but also misleading, because this wasn't David and Goliath. This was two giants bleeding each other slowly while civilians hid beneath kitchen tables. You visit a rehabilitation clinic in Tel Aviv. Inside, victims of bombings, Jewish and Arab, sit side by side in physical therapy. One lost a leg in a bus explosion, the other in a retaliatory airstrike. Neither one speaks. They just stretch, sweat, and exist in the same painful silence. You ask the therapist how she manages. She shrugs. We don't treat ideology, just scar tissue. You step outside and catch a glimpse of another mural, this one painted by Israeli kids. It shows handprints in red, green, blue, and white. Above it, in Hebrew, we all bleed the same. You nod, but not everyone agrees. You walk through a West Bank neighborhood where the Israeli Defense Forces recently demolished a home. You meet a boy whose older brother died in the Second Intifada. He shows you a video of him rapping, verses in Arabic and English about checkpoints and dreams deferred. You ask what he wants. He says, a passport that works. You visit an Israeli settlement school where kids are learning about the Intifadas in history class. The map on the board has no green line. The teacher points to a red circle around Nablus. This, she says, was a terror hotbed. You don't argue. You just notice how the students avoid the word neighbor. Later, you meet a former soldier who served during the Second Intifada. He's quiet, drinks his coffee slowly. "We thought we were protecting ourselves," he says. "Then one night I looked at the faces on the other side of the rifle, and they were just kids." You ask if he still believes in peace. He sighs. "I believe in regret." And that's the thing about uprisings. They don't just rise. They echo, in songs, in scars, in the way people flinch at sudden sounds, in the way they name their children after the ones they've lost. As you leave the town, someone's painted 3 words on a cracked wall in English. "Stones don't forget, and neither do the people who throw them." The road winds uphill now, into territory marked by shadows, of walls, towers, and silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of heavy things unsaid. You're walking along the separation barrier, also known by different names depending on which side of it you're standing. Israelis call it the security fence. Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. The name is not just semantics. It's a story, a worldview, a wound. It's made of concrete in some parts, fencing in others, 25 feet tall in cities, topped with wire, studded with cameras, mapped by drones. It snakes for over 400 miles through the West Bank, not along the internationally recognized Green Line, but deep inside, annexing farmland, cutting through neighborhoods, encircling lives. A mainstream fact, the wall was built after the Second Intifada, largely as a response to a wave of deadly suicide bombings. Israeli officials say it dramatically reduced attacks. Palestinian voices say it wasn't the wall, but diplomacy, exhaustion, and shifts in strategy. You press your hand against the cold concrete. It's been painted and repainted. Murals of doves, keys, soldiers, children. Graffiti in English, Arabic, Hebrew, French. One says, "This wall will fall." Another says, "We've learned to grow around it." You meet a farmer named Munir. His land lies on the other side of the wall. To reach it, he needs a permit. Sometimes he gets one. Sometimes he doesn't. He shows you photos of his grandfather harvesting olives where a military gate now stands. "The trees still wait for me," he says, "but they don't ask questions anymore." You walk with him to a fenced-off patch of land. A soldier unlocks the gate. Munir nods in thanks. The soldier doesn't reply. That's the routine. They don't speak. They just coexist under obligation. A quirky fact. In some neighborhoods, the wall runs so close to homes that residents can lean out the window and touch it. In others, it loops around entire villages, leaving just one entrance, a road controlled by IDF checkpoints. One town, Bil'in, became known worldwide for weekly non-violent protests where villagers marched toward the wall carrying signs, costumes, and, occasionally, mirrors, so the soldiers would see themselves. You follow a boy in Bil'in who leads you to the remnants of a gate once torn open during a demonstration. "We planted sunflowers here," he says. "They took the seeds, said they were a threat." You smile, but it stings. On the Israeli side, the wall feels different, cleaner, maintained. Some stretches are landscaped, even softened by trees. It blends into the suburbs. Most people pass it without thinking. For many, it's just there, like a highway divider or a coastline, naturalized by repetition. You meet a young Israeli woman named Talia. She's lived near the wall her whole life. "I used to be afraid of the other side," she admits. "But when I turned 18, I joined the army and saw it up close. It wasn't what I thought, just people, tired people." She pauses, then adds, "Now I live a few blocks from it. My dog barks every time a bird lands on the fence." You ask if it feels like safety. She considers. "It feels like forgetting something on purpose." You pass through a neighborhood in East Jerusalem where the wall divides streets, splits families, and interrupts traffic like a scar. On one side, residents pay taxes to the Israeli government but receive minimal services. On the other side, the garbage truck never comes. The road ends in a checkpoint. A man named Ahmad invites you to his rooftop. He points to his mother's house, just 400 meters away. But the wall makes it a 30-minute drive. He used to jump over. Now there are cameras. You ask how often he sees her. He smiles tightly. Sundays, if the permit comes. Historians still argue whether the wall is a temporary security measure or a long-term land grab, whether it's a response or a strategy. But no one disputes what it does to the fabric of daily life. Phrase it. You stop for tea in a village where the wall loops into a semicircle. The only exit is controlled by an electronic gate. School buses line up here every morning. The kids know the soldiers by name. Some wave, some don't. Inside the cafe, a man shows you a photo of the land his family lost. It wasn't just soil, he says. It was rhythm, where we walked, where we sat. You don't just rebuild that. You walk beside the wall at night. The lamps cast long shadows. A woman is painting over old graffiti with a new mural, this one of two hands reaching across barbed wire. One hand has a Star of David, the other a Palestinian bracelet. You ask what inspired her. She shrugs. I just want it to be ugly for the right reasons. A group of tourists walks past, taking selfies with the wall in the background. One of them adjusts their hair. Another says, "This is so raw." You step aside and let them pass. Further along, you find a small shrine wedged into a crack in the wall. Inside, a candle and a tiny stuffed bear. No note, no explanation. But you know, because even concrete can mourn. You trace your fingers along the surface as you walk and wonder, what kind of safety must be built so tall? What kind of peace needs so many locks? And how many walls are built not to keep others out, but to keep ourselves from seeing what's already in? You leave the wall behind, but it follows you, if not in concrete, then in memory. Because the farther you walk, the more you realize this conflict isn't just mapped in geography or policy. It's woven into voices. So you begin to listen, not to politicians, not to soldiers, but to poets, journalists, gravediggers, teachers, the ones who don't get interviewed, but who still carry history in the lines of their faces and the cadence of their grief. You start in Haifa, inside a cramped bookshop with uneven floors and a tiny stage in the back. Tonight is spoken word night. The poet performing speaks in Arabic, then English. I used to write poems about love. Then I learned to write poems about checkpoints. Now I write poems about how to fall asleep between them. The crowd claps, not politely but urgently, as if affirmation could protect the words from vanishing. You meet the poet afterward. Her name is Noor. She's 23. She's never left Israel, but she's been followed home by drones. She says the hardest part about writing in this place isn't what to say, it's what to leave out. A mainstream fact, roughly 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian Arabs. They vote, they pay taxes, they hold Israeli passports. But many live in what they describe as second gear. Not officially repressed, but rarely fully included. Noor says her poetry isn't protest. It's permission, she explains, to feel something other than strategy. You nod, because after all the meetings and maps, you're beginning to crave emotion over policy. You move on to Bethlehem. There's a gallery here where artists hang photographs of demolished homes beside wedding portraits. The juxtaposition is jarring. One man's family photo is nailed next to the only surviving wall of his childhood house. A visitor points and says, "How symbolic." The curator winces. "It's not a metaphor," she says. "It's just Tuesday." You head south to a graveyard outside Hebron. You meet a man who tends to the stones, keeps them clean, weeds the grass, collects lost shoes that blow in from the road. His name is Walid. He doesn't talk much, but he walks you to a row of unmarked graves. "These," he says, "are the ones no one came back for." A quirky fact, many of the gravestones here list not birth dates, but years of expulsion, 1948, 1967. Time is measured by what was lost, not what was lived. Walid points to a patch of empty earth. "Reserved," he says dryly, then shrugs. "This land, it always needs space for more." You walk away slowly. Next, you're in Jaffa, at a cafe owned by an elderly Jewish woman named Rivka. Her family fled pogroms in Poland and arrived here in 1935. She remembers when Jaffa was mixed: Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Greeks. We all bought bread from the same man, she says. Then we started buying guns instead. You ask her what changed. Everything, she says. And nothing. You sip thick coffee and listen as she recites the address of the house her parents lived in. The street name has changed. The building's gone. But she repeats the number anyway, like it's still waiting for her to come home. You take a bus eastward, toward Nablus, and sit beside a young man scrolling through Twitter. He's translating news from Arabic to English, posting updates from the ground. Western media takes too long, he says, so I post before the story gets rewritten. His name is Sammy. He shows you a thread of videos, some blurry, some sharp. Protesters, soldiers, a child with a flag taller than he is. Sammy sighs. Sometimes I think I'm documenting a wound that keeps reopening just to prove it's still there. Historians still argue whether journalism in this region reflects reality, or shapes it. Whether objectivity is even possible when the facts live under occupation and the footage depends on where your phone battery runs out. You meet a woman who used to work for a major Western outlet. She left after her story about settler violence was edited until the word violence vanished. Now I freelance, she says. Truth is expensive, but lies come prepackaged. You visit a youth theater group in Ramallah. They're rehearsing a play called The Checkpoint Monologues. Each actor tells a true story. Missed weddings, delayed funerals, the silent dignity of being searched for the 6th time in a single morning. One monologue ends with the line, "The soldier asked where I was going. I said, forward." You clap with the others, though your chest feels tight. Later that night, you sit by a bonfire in a Bedouin encampment. An old man sings a song that his grandfather sang before 1948. The melody is slow, haunting. The lyrics speak of hills, goats, wind, and betrayal. You ask if it's about the conflict. He chuckles. It's about rain, he says. But the sky stopped listening. You listen anyway, because here, even the things that aren't political sound like elegies. You head back north and visit an Israeli journalist named Dov who's been covering the West Bank since the 80s. His house is filled with photos, some printed, some ripped out of magazines, some saved from laptops too old to boot. I don't write to convince, he says. I write because silence is never neutral. You ask him what's changed in all his years of coverage. He thinks for a long time. Then he says, we've all gotten better at forgetting things while they're still happening. And now, standing under a sky that somehow holds both peace and tension, you realize something. The most honest archive of this conflict doesn't exist in treaties or textbooks. It lives in poems, in murals, in the back corners of photo albums. It lives in songs that never made the charts, in tweets that vanish, in whispers traded across barbed wire, and in all the voices that didn't need a headline to be true. You walk now without a fixed direction. That happens when you reach the edges of history, when the path splits in too many directions, and none of them feel paved. You're chasing futures now, not facts. You want to know, is there still a way out? Or are we just learning to live better inside the maze? 2 states, 1 state, confederation, federation, binationalism, autonomy, annexation, partition. You've heard all the proposals. You've seen all the diagrams. But right now, you want to feel the shape of what's still possible. So you begin with the idea that was supposed to solve everything, the 2-state solution. A mainstream fact, the 2-state model envisions an independent Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza, living side by side with Israel, based loosely on the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital. It has been the dominant framework of negotiations for decades. And yet, it's further from reality than ever. You walk through a Palestinian village just a few kilometers from Jerusalem, now encircled by the wall and flanked on 3 sides by settlements. It has 1 entrance. Every morning, people wait 2 hours to go 10 miles. A woman at the checkpoint asks you, how can we have a state if we can't leave our town? You have no answer. You visit a cartographer's office in Ramallah. The walls are lined with maps. Palestine from 1947, 1967, 2000, 2020. The latest one looks like a shattered window. Tiny green islands of Palestinian control floating in a sea of Israeli-administered land. You can't have a country made of crumbs, he says. Even if they give you a flag. You visit a Jewish settlement nearby. It looks like any suburban town in the US. Lawns, playgrounds, barbecues. A man invites you to his porch. I'd love peace, he says. But I'm not going anywhere. This is Judea. We're home. You ask if he supports a two-state deal. He shakes his head. Why should I need a passport to visit my ancestors' graves? You keep walking. In Ramallah, you meet a Palestinian politician who still clings to the Oslo model. He talks about international recognition, phased withdrawals, symbolic capitals. We have a right to exist, he says. But they think we're a footnote. Historians still argue whether the two-state solution was ever truly viable, or whether it was a diplomatic mirage, a stalling tactic disguised as hope. What's not debated? That time is its enemy. Every new settlement, every wall, every broken promise. They don't erase the idea. They just make it harder to draw. You ask an Israeli activist what she thinks. She sighs. We kept negotiating land, but we never negotiated people. So now some turn to alternatives. You meet a professor in Jerusalem who speaks of a one-state solution. A shared, democratic country with equal rights for Jews and Palestinians. No more fences. No more dividing lines. Sounds clean, noble, and terrifying, because equality means the end of Jewish demographic control. And to many Israelis, that feels like the end of Jewish safety. We didn't build this country to become a minority again. One woman tells you, history taught us what that means. In Nablus, you ask the same question in reverse. Would you live in a shared country? The man shrugs. I already live with them, just without rights. You walk through a university campus where students are debating confederation. Two states, one open border. Like the EU. Shared economy. Mutual recognition. You hear passion, curiosity, even jokes, until someone brings up water. And someone else brings up the right of return. And suddenly, the chalkboard becomes a battlefield again. A quirky fact, there's a grassroots project called The Land for All, where Israelis and Palestinians jointly propose confederation as a pragmatic path forward. They host meetings in coffee shops, online forums, even hiking trails. They say walking together makes it harder to argue. You think of the trails you've walked and wonder if they're right. You visit a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon who says none of these models matter if the diaspora isn't included. You can't build peace on stolen ground, he says. It has to include return, or it's just a prettier version of injustice. You talk to an Israeli mother whose son was killed in a stabbing. She says she no longer cares about borders, only about stopping the next child from dying. She's part of a group called Parent Circle, where bereaved families from both sides meet, cry, and remember. Grief, she says, is a language we all speak. You visit a polling office in Tel Aviv. Surveys show Israeli support for two states is dropping. In Ramallah, it's dropped too. Not because people want more war, but because they don't believe peace is being negotiated in good faith. They've stopped betting on maps. You walk through a square where someone scrawled, "From the river to the sea," in bold letters. You pause, because that phrase means liberation to some, and annihilation to others. And in that difference lies the entire fault line. So what's left? Maybe something smaller, more fragile. You visit a kindergarten where Jewish and Arab children learn side by side. They argue over crayons, not borders. One little girl draws a flag with both stars and crescents. She doesn't explain it, just hands it to you like a gift. You fold it gently, because here, imagination might be the rarest currency. You finish your walk at a hilltop just before sundown. The view stretches across lands both claimed and contested. A breeze moves through the grass. Somewhere, a muezzin calls to prayer. Somewhere else, a shofar sounds. Two voices, two rhythms. One land, And maybe, if we're brave enough, one future that neither side has fully imagined yet. Word count 1099. Awaiting, continue.
Bạn đã nói.
Continue.
Jack đã nói.
Section 19. The sun lowers now, casting gold across stones that have held more history than most countries. The light softens the edges of everything. The rooftops, the walls, the ruins, the memories. You walk slower. Not because you're tired, though you are, but because something about the moment asks for reverence. You're standing somewhere between the present and what could be. This section of land doesn't belong to any one solution. It's not about policies or protests or who controls which gate. It's about the fragile possibility that coexistence might not need to be perfect to be real. You find yourself in a place called Neve Shalom Wahat al-Salam in Arabic, Oasis of Peace, a cooperative village founded by both Jews and Arabs. Not a utopia, not a fantasy, but something braver, an experiment. Here, Hebrew and Arabic share the same school walls. The teachers co-plan lessons. The children learn each other's holidays. Disagreements happen, but they happen across dinner tables, not barricades. A mainstream fact, Neve Shalom has existed since the 1970s. It's small, fewer than 100 families, but it continues, despite waves of war and politics crashing on either side. When things get tense elsewhere, they gather here under the olive trees and talk it out. You sit with a woman named Sulwa. She's Palestinian, grew up in Jerusalem, teaches music. Her students know both national anthems. She says they sing them as duets. It sounds awful, she laughs, but it's ours. Later, you meet Danny, a Jewish father who moved here after his IDF service. I saw too much, he says. I needed to believe in something else. He says it slowly, like it's still hard to say. They both admit it's not easy, that raising kids to respect two narratives takes more energy than choosing a side, that they get hate mail, that the media only shows up when something burns. But we're still here, Sulwa says. Sometimes that's enough. You walk the footpaths of the village, past homes with mezuzahs and Arabic calligraphy side by side. One child has drawn a poster that reads, "My dad says peace is boring. I think that's good." You smile, because boring sounds like progress. You travel next to an orchard outside Tulkarm. A Jewish and Palestinian agricultural cooperative grows almonds here. The paperwork took 5 years. The irrigation system longer. But the trees are thriving. So are the farmers. You ask one of them what it's like to share land. He shrugs. Better than sharing funerals. Historians still argue whether these shared spaces are scalable, whether they are signs of hope or simply exceptions. But walking through them, you start to think maybe exceptions are the seeds of new rules. You meet a pair of students at a university in Haifa. One's from Nazareth, the other from Tel Aviv. They argue constantly about politics, but they co-wrote a play together about two grandmothers, one from Lod, the other from Jaffa, trying to reclaim the same house. It was a hit. I think people are just tired of screaming, one of them says. So we made them laugh instead. A quirky fact, there are joint Israeli-Palestinian orchestras, choirs, theater groups, even environmental teams tracking shared water sources. They rarely make headlines, but they make noise, the kind that brings people together instead of pushing them apart. You attend one such rehearsal. The conductor stops the music suddenly. "You're not listening to each other," she scolds. And it hits you, that could be a peace slogan. You pass through a tech incubator in East Jerusalem where young entrepreneurs from both sides are building startups. One app lets travelers tour holy sites with dual narratives, Jewish and Palestinian, layered over each other like augmented reality. You try it. At the Western Wall, you hear the story of exile, longing, and divine presence. Then, with a tap, you hear about neighborhoods cleared for archaeological parks. 2 stories, same stones. You ask the developers if they think the app can change anything. Maybe not, one says, but maybe it can help someone listen for 5 more minutes. You pause at a rooftop cafe where young people are drinking mint lemonade, arguing about lyrics and curfews and whose cousin got arrested last week. One girl sighs and says, I just want to be 20 without having to be symbolic. You understand. Because the burden of representation is exhausting. You head south again to a checkpoint that's unusually quiet. A soldier waves you through with a look that says he'd rather be anywhere else. Beyond him, a Palestinian boy rides a bicycle in wide circles. He waves and you wave back. It means nothing, and it means everything. You're not naive. You know this place still burns. That tomorrow a rocket may fall, or a raid may come. That grief still lives in the corners of every kitchen. That peace agreements are as fragile as soap bubbles in the wind. But still, these glimpses matter, because beneath the cement and slogans, there's a truth no wall can erase. People are already living the future others are still afraid to imagine. And now, you return to where you started, not to a specific street or shrine, but to the feeling of walking through a story still being written. One where every chapter ends with a comma instead of a period. You're back among olive trees. Some of them were planted recently, saplings wrapped in protective netting. Others have stood for centuries, their roots thick with memory, their trunks split and gnarled like the history they've quietly watched pass by. You sit beneath one now. The shade is calm and heavy. This tree doesn't care about maps. It's seen empires rise, crusaders clash, borders shift, families cry, and generations be born under siege and starlight. Just watched people build, burn, and build again. And through it all, it stayed. You press your hand to the bark. It's rough but warm, like something alive that refuses to let go. Nearby, a shepherd guides his flock down the slope. No flag in his hand, no ideology, just a stick, a song, and the trust of animals who know the land better than any general. You wonder if he remembers the names of the hills the same way others remember the names of the fallen. Because here, names carry weight. Cities are named for prophets. Streets are named for martyrs. Babies are named for grandfathers who died defending orchards. And everything, even silence, has a name. You wander to a low stone wall. On it, someone has carved a message. We will not vanish quietly. Next to it, in different handwriting, we are not your enemy. And below both, faint but still legible, we share the same sky. You lean back and stare upward. That sky has never been occupied, never divided, never patrolled. It's just there, stretching from the Galilee to Gaza, from Tel Aviv to Jenin. It watches over minarets and synagogues. It carries the smoke of rockets and the prayers of children who don't know what side they're supposed to be on. And under that sky, a truth settles in. That every border is a story someone decided was permanent. That every flag is a decision to remember one version of pain. And that peace, real peace, isn't silence. It's sound shared. You get up slowly and walk one last stretch of land. Along the path, you find small offerings. Stones placed on graves, feathers tied to fences, a note folded into a crack in a wall. You don't read it. You don't need to. You know what it says. It says, remember me, not just the people who've died, but the ones who've dared to live through this. A father who builds a swing set between army raids. A teacher who rewrites history lessons with two versions of every event. A young couple who argue about politics over tea and still kiss each other goodnight. A boy who flies a kite not to protest, but just to see something rise. You walk until the horizon swallows the noise, until the language softens, until all the lines on the map blur into one unbroken slope of earth. And you remember something someone once said. Not a general, not a scholar, just a woman who lost her brother in a war that neither side even wanted. Peace is not the end of fighting. It's the start of remembering together. You stop, and you listen. The olive trees are whispering again. And now you lie still, not because the story is over, but because your part in it tonight has paused. Let the tension go from your shoulders. Let your jaw loosen. Let your eyes grow heavy, not from sadness, but from knowing that even in a world filled with borders and barriers, the act of listening is its own quiet resistance. You've walked through centuries, through dust and barbed wire, through poems and prayers, through voices too often drowned out by headlines. And you've made it here, beneath these trees, under this quiet sky, where the earth doesn't ask who you are before giving you shade. Breathe in. Let your breath travel the land. Across hills, over rivers, under watchtowers, and through broken windows mended with tape and faith. Breathe out. Let it carry away the weight of division just for now. Let it soften the sharp edges of names you don't need to argue over tonight. Tomorrow, the world will still argue. It will still build walls, still draft policies, still shout. But tonight, you're a listener, a witness, a quiet keeper of a story most people only ever see in fragments. Let the memory of olive trees guide you into rest. Let the soft echo of two languages lull you to sleep. And if you dream, let it be of laughter shared around a common table, of stars that shine the same for everyone, of footsteps that no longer need to tiptoe around grief. Close your eyes. You've walked far enough. You're safe here, under this sky, with the story. Together,